Hello. Hello, everybody. This is Professor Lee Miles, Professor of Crisis and Disaster Management at Bournemouth University Disaster Management Centre. And I'm going to talk to you today about disaster management and with the title, Why Use a Case Study Approach? And the idea of this presentation is to give you some insight into why we can use a case study approach to better evaluate and inform our study of disaster management and use it in many ways. And understand it as a technique that can be used. So I think the important thing to first recognise is that when we think about disaster management itself, that actually it is in many ways can be applied and is often applied as part of the art of being a very good disaster management practitioner. Indeed, what I'm arguing here is a very simple point, that in the practical world of disaster management, case studies are often the way. There is often a common approach that's used by practitioners to draw lessons identified, lessons learned, and as part of the evaluation process of trying to build back better and bounce forwards. Indeed, I would argue, as I do in this slide, that what you actually find amongst practitioners is that the case study approach is often a reflex. It's often the most common thing that they use in terms of reports. So we see it everywhere. And why do we see it everywhere? Well, often the use of cases is often in response to there being a particular type of disaster or a particular type of event. So it may be Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or it might be Hurricane Super Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines, or it might be Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean. And practitioners there are trying to identify that there's been a particular event. There's a lot of policy, public, political, economic and social attention to that particular event, and therefore they try to investigate why it happened and how effective the disaster management system, actors and agents have worked into achieving it. So often then, in many ways, what I'm trying to argue is that the case study reflex or the case study approach is something that is commonly used by practitioners. And indeed, amongst those people that are practitioners on this course, as part of professional practice, this approach should be the one that you feel most familiar with. But where can we find a case study approach? Well, what I've done in this slide is to identify in many ways what I would perceive to be 5 areas where a case study reflex or a case study approach is often used as an example of best practice. The first is it's part of delivering simulations and exercises. So, policy makers, emergency planners, disaster managers may develop an emergency plan, but they're usually writing and formulating and implementing that emergency plan in response to what they perceive to be the different types and probabilities of risks, which are usually identifying particular type of hazards, particular type of threats, or in particular probability of likely events. And why is that important? Well, it's important because actually then, when you're trying to test or exercise your emergency plan, you usually develop a simulation which is based around a case study. It might be a mock cyclone in Oman. It might be a tentative hurricane in the Caribbean. It could be a man-made threat or bombing incident in the UK. Or it could be a fire in Berlin. But really what we're doing is that simulations are in many ways the practical implementation of case studies. Case studies that are often drawn from real life. So at the heart of trying to learn lessons comes simulations and exercises, and from that also comes that we're trying to draw lessons from those case studies through simulations and exercises. The way also to think about this is that the practitioners often use a case study reflex in a particular way. As we well know, we talk about lessons identified and lessons learned. We take a particular case, we look at how the disaster management system is operated, and we try to identify particular lessons from that case, which can then be applied upstreamed upwards into the bigger picture. So it's the way we often identify lessons, and we draw lessons from cases. But from that as lessons, we may often identify lessons, but we often try to learn the lessons that come from that. So we try to formulate from the lessons that we've identified the lessons that need to be learned and put into practice as part of further amendments and revisions to emergency plans, or in the hope of making us more effective in dealing with particular type of disasters if they happen again. So if flooding takes place in Accra in Ghana, as it did in 2018 and 2017 and 2016, the hope is that every year we would be able to identify the lessons from each particular case of flooding and learn lessons to make our response better in the following year. So we draw lessons that can be identified, and we formulate particular lessons learned, which we often use case studies as evidence, an evidence approach to illustrate why those lessons should be learned. And of course, it's also important as part of our process of learning and enhancing resilience. What I mean by that is resilience, as we all know from previous lectures, can take various different forms. Resilience is supposed to be about learning and developing things from the bottom up, through the individual, through the community, through the organisations. It's part of a kind of holistic picture of trying to make us learn and be better at dealing with disaster management. And also it's part of a process of improving, if you like, organisational resilience. It's part of a process of building those learned lessons into how we enhance resilience. So at the heart of when Sendai or Hyoga or the UN frameworks talk about building back better, it's also about bouncing forward as part of a process that we never really stay, and we never stay static with resilience. As part of building back better, we also try to adapt and learn forwards. What I'm trying to argue here is a very simple point, that we never really stay the same after a major disaster. We are experienced from it, and we try to learn from it. And therefore, as part of the process of bouncing forwards, as it's often called, then we often need to incorporate lessons from particular cases. And the cases are the way we try to draw the lessons, to formulate the lessons learned, and then to build them into future practice, and therefore bounce forward and learn from that experience. So it's part of bouncing forwards, and not just building back better with resilience. But ultimately, how do we do that? And this is my final point. Really, the example with practitioners when using a case study approach is they, as it says here, they learn from the micro example of a case, a particular case, to inform the macro, the bigger picture. So they try to take an analysis of a particular case, a particular event, like Hurricane Irma, a particular single event, try to draw out those lessons and then apply them as general principles or general lessons that could be applied to the entirety of the disaster management system. And that also applies upwards into the international environment. So if we take the example of Fukushima, for example, with the Japanese civil nuclear reactor, which exploded after the tsunami and the flooding in Japan, then those lessons led to a 5-year review where the case of the Japanese experience of Fukushima led to a wider lessons learned, which could be enhanced into the international environment and learned by the entire international community. We take the micro example of a particular event, or the micro example of a particular hazard, an experience of disaster, and try to macro it out, build it out into the bigger picture, so we can learn general lessons for all, and not just for the particular people who've experienced the disaster. So that's the art of a disaster management practitioner, but you can also argue that actually cases have been quite important when we talk about the art of the disaster management academic. But really the traditional approach has been that is to use case studies often with an essay style reflex, as we talk about. Traditionally the way we would do this as an academic is first we would look at the literature. We'd look at key writers, key concepts, and critically assess them. Which ones we're using, how the landscape looks in terms of literature, what are the key concepts that have been applied, and what new concepts can we apply to new areas. So we would traditionally start with the concept first, and then use that to use a case study to test that concept, to test the validity of it, or to test whether it's useful or not, or whether it could be amended, its relevance, its resonance, and its validation. So with an academic would use in many ways a case study as a way of illustrating either a concept or to test that concept and its validity. So in many ways, the way an academic uses a case study is slightly different from a practitioner. In the academic environment, we'd start with a big concept, the macro, we go to the case study, the micro, to look at the case study, and then we build out from the micro to the macro. So the essay style reflex of the academic is to go from the macro concept to the smaller case study as an illustration of that. to go from the macro to the micro, and then eventually back to the macro, as opposed to this, what we have with the practitioners, where case studies are often where we start, and then we try to learn lessons. We go from the micro straight to the macro. But no matter which way we look at this, and they're not in any way mutually incompatible, what we're trying to say is that case study approaches are very useful to the study of disaster management. And what we're arguing really as part of our course here at Bournemouth University is that really, as you know, our course in Masters in Disaster Management is highly orientated towards professional practice, research-informed professional practice, professional practice informed research. What we're effectively trying to create is the art of the pracademic, the practice-orientated academic, or the academically informed practitioner, whichever way you want to call it. And here, using case studies in disaster management can be used in many different useful ways. And what I do in this slide is really just to highlight why use of case studies is so common in the field of disaster management. Well, of course, the first place to start is that case studies can be used to illustrate and examine disaster management structures. So we might be talking about looking at examining, for example, the United States Incident Command System, or the UK-based Major Incident Management System, MIMS. So here we're looking at a particular system, and we're trying to look at that system. We're trying to see what its strengths and weaknesses of that particular case study of that system, and to draw out the lessons from that for disaster management more widely. So in this case, the case study is the system itself, is the particular type of disaster management structure that's being created. Our second point is we might be looking at examining a particular type of disaster management decision making. It might actually be looking at a particular type of decision making process, or actually when and where decisions are made. And this, of course, is very important, because what you tend to find is you may have a common experience, for example, of a hurricane like Irma, which went across the Caribbean, affected many British overseas territories and sovereign states in the Caribbean. But the decision-making responses of the various islands was different in many cases. So we can actually look at the cases of particular events in terms of how it affects the decision-making structure, when decisions are made, why they're made, and how they're made. So we can use the case study of disaster management decision-making, and usually our subject area may be the case, may be the decision-making system, or it could be actually the disaster and how it affects the decision-making system. But what we're all doing is that basically we can look at cases of decision-making, and we end up with some very interesting analogies. So, for example, it's argued when we look at Grenfell fire, for example, recently in 2018, if we look at the a couple of years ago, then Grenfell is particularly important because there was also a series of fires in other tower blocks in the United Kingdom over the previous decades, and each of those key decisions were made. Decisions, for example, with stay put policy, where the emergency responders advised people to stay put in their flats when the fire outbreak. And we can identify why those decisions were made at the particular point and how they were common or not common according to different types of similar events. Our third type of case study can actually be of decision-making actors and agency. So it can be, particularly in the world of crisis management, for example, that we might actually have studies looking at particular type of decision-making actors. So we're looking, for example, at why particular prime ministers or presidents in the United States made particular decisions and their role in disasters. It might be related to their powers and what powers they had. It might be related to their perspectives. It might be related to actually their role and the role of them as actors. So, for example, does it make a difference, for example, if we have, for example, a Republican president in the United States, and the criticism, for example, that President Bush had in relation to his handling of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, compared to Democratic President Obama when dealing, for example, with shootings in schools? And is that different now to President Trump in his handling of similar shootings in schools, for example, in other parts of the United States? So we might be looking at the role of particular actors and the case of a particular actors. It might also be that we're looking at the case of the agency, the role of FEMA in the United States, the role of COBRA in the United Kingdom, the role of a particular type of NGO, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, or Oxfam, for example, and the recent problems they've had recently over recent years in relation to corruption and issues to do with the conduct of their staff. So it could be we're looking at particular types of agency in terms of disaster management. And then, of course, we get on to the very common area that we also can use case studies to group types of disasters with man-made or natural disasters, or whether we're talking about fires, terrorist events, or, for example, explosions. And we can also look at, therefore, as a way of use cases to group types of disasters together to see whether there's common approaches. So we might, for example, look at whether a hurricane in the Caribbean is similar to a cyclone in Oman or a typhoon in the Philippines. And we might also look at particular disaster events in different parts of the world to see whether they're handled differently according to different cultural dimensions. And this brings us on to our fourth area where case studies can be used for countries. So we often look at a particular country and its experiences. And probably a good example of that is we have projects in Bournemouth University looking, for example, at disaster management in Africa. But we're looking at in Ghana with NADMO, the National Disaster Management Organization, or NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency in Nigeria, or the Department of Civil Protection in Cameroon. So we're trying to identify that there may be different approaches, different experiences of different types of disasters. And it actually comes from the fact that you might be actually are looking at particular countries because they have differing disaster management histories. So we often look at the Philippines, for example, as a country case study because it has a large experience of different types of disasters. Philippines is often called the supermarket of disasters because it's within the ring of fire. It has problems with earthquakes, it has problems with typhoons, it has problems with landslides, and it also has some man-made issues to do with political stability. So in that ways, we look at particular countries as kind of landmark areas where they experience a multitude of disasters. Or we may go to countries like New Zealand, for example, who have a long-scale earthquake experience to specialise in a particular area. Or we may be looking at a particular disaster management history because we might say they're more advanced. They're at the cutting edge of disaster management concepts, like, for example, Japan. So it's often the case that disaster management is often obsessed with looking at Japan because Japan is a place which has both advanced systems and large amounts of experience of dealing with regular disasters, for example. And our final area is that we might be looking at case studies because of international institutions and frameworks. To give you an example, if one looks, for example, at issues to do with pandemics or health issues, then the role of the World Health Organization, the WHO, as a case study in its role in dealing with different types of disasters and the guidance that it gives is important. Equally, when we talk about the tourism area, we might talk about the United Nations World Tourism Organization, the UNWTO, when we're thinking about how we advise on travel and tourism crises, for example. Or we might be talking about the general disaster risk reduction frameworks of the UNISDR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And here, for example, we're looking at Hyogo and Sendai frameworks. So we can look at all of those different hubs, but we can also look at particular organisations in dealing with disaster response. So in the Caribbean, we might want to look at SEDEMA as an organisation with groups of countries trying to work together to better enhance disaster management response. So these are all examples of case studies where these can be applied. But each of those case studies is important simply because it's often a micro area which is trying to draw out more general lessons. And that's what we're trying to think about in this way. Now, why is this important for this? And I just want to really move on to two major aspects. Really, I want us from an academic perspective, because after all, you're doing a master's in disaster management, is to illustrate why this is important, and also a rough guide to advise you on the best ways to deal with case studies. So, from an academic perspective, there's a particular way we can use case studies, and broadly, you could say that this is in relation. There could be 4 points. The first point is that we often use case studies to test and validate key theories, concepts, or a research design. So we might be looking at complexity theory, for example, or we might be looking at foresight theory, or we might be looking at certain types of crisis communication theory like framing and blaming. And we'll develop that theory to say, well, actually it has important lessons, concepts to inform the way we think about disaster management. And then we'll usually apply a case study. So, for example, the work in the Disaster Management Centre on single points of failure has been developed as a concept. We talk about SPOFs, for example, or SPOF, single points of failure concepts. And we often then apply it to particular types of disasters. We may look, for example, at the Grenfell fire, man-made ones, or we might be looking at responses to hurricanes in the Caribbean, if we think of natural disasters. But we also, alongside that, often use that case study to test and practice a particular methodology. So when you're thinking about a case study, it's not just the area, the subject, but also the approach that you're going to take. Are we looking at this case study through an existing prism, through an existing concept, or are we looking at it in a new way? And what I would argue it's very important is that what we're thinking about here is that it's often best in our world of disaster management to use a case study not too broadly. We want to understand that we're really looking at a particular number of things within a case study to draw out. Say 5 or 6 key elements of a case study, and we're trying to explore those in a bit more depth so we can draw out some real lessons identified, which can have generic and wider practice at the macro level. In other words, the methodology you use, whether it's a document survey, so you're going to be looking at documents, for example, or whether you're going to be using a qualitative survey, so you're going to be looking at storytelling or people's accounts of what happened in a disaster, or whether you're going to be using data, sort of GDP figures, GDP per capita figures, levels of livelihood. These are all different methodologies which we can use to test, say, the impact of a particular type of hurricane. So what are we using the case? How are we going to look at the case study? And what is the case study going to be looked at in terms of the methodology that we're using? So concepts, methodology, and case studies are related to each other. And you need to nearly always be quite particular. Don't try and do too much with all three. Pick a particular concept, particular type of methodology, and a particular type of case. And do more with less. And why is that important? Well, it brings me on to my third point. Well, actually, what we're trying to do is we're using case studies to understand rather complex processes and process and practice mapping via the micro-analysis of key events. So we're actually looking at particular events at particular times in a case study. And we're trying to often draw out snapshots of what happened, when and where, and illustrate why that's important, why it can be looked at for a particular theory. So in a sense, try not to do too much. And actually, I would not get involved too much in a simple seeing case studies simply just describe what happened. That is really what you should not do. You should really identify what you see as being the key concepts that you're going to look at, and look at the case study in particular in relation to that. And equally, if you were to concentrate on the case study entirely, then try to look at the case in a particular way, through a particular perspective, through a particular viewpoint, and from that be able to draw out very quickly what you need. The micro-analysis of key events is what we're talking about here. And that's important because by thinking micro, we can draw out particular identified lessons. And from that, we can draw them out and upstream them to identify wider lessons, validations, and fortifications that can be applied more generally. It's a very simple point. Case studies, if they're too general and we're trying to do too many things with them, often means that will lead to rather very blurred and rather ambiguous and vague micro lessons, which become even more blurred and more ambiguous and have less resonance when one tries to make them more general. So, stay micro, try and stay specific, and from that, draw out specific lessons for the wider environment. Now, tips then for using case studies in disaster management. And what I want to really do is just to walk you through what I would see as being a very good rough guide to be able to do that. The first is to outline the key research puzzle or research question that acts as the rationale for looking at the case study. In simple terms, why are you using the particular case study? Is it because of the magnitude of the disaster? It's a big thing and it's never been that big before, so it's a kind of extreme example, and therefore we should be able to draw examples because of its magnitude. That should be clearer because it's bigger. Is it because of the relevance of that particular case? It may be that we're actually looking at a rather small event. It might be, for example, excuse the point, an air crash, a particular type of air crash that has major ramifications for the way we think about air safety. So if we think about for example, Germanwings, where a pilot locked himself in a cabin and crashed his plane into a mountain. In sense, led to of course, the death of many people. In fact, all of the people on the flight, and was therefore a tragedy, but had much greater relevance for the entire aircraft industry because it also illustrated some major issues to do with procedures, to do with whether we should lock cabin crew away from the rest of the plane. Or is it because it's the most recent example? Often you'll find when you read in journals, you will see lots of case studies, and the case study is because it's the most recent one, so Hurricane Irma takes place, everybody writes on Hurricane Irma. Then the next hurricane takes place the following year, be it Hurricane Michael, and everybody writes about that one. Is it the contemporary nature of the event because it's the most recent snapshot of what we've got that we can learn from? So why are we using it? Is it because of its size, its relevance, or its timing, is I guess what we're arguing here. Or is it all three? And if that's the case, this should affect our research design. What is being looked at in the particular study? So if the first idea is why are we using the case study, why are we looking at the case study, our second point is what are we looking at in the case study? And here it should be that if we're looking at a particular type of concept, say it's organizational resilience, for example, as a concept, then we might argue that actually, well, we're only looking at the organizational design of the disaster management agency that we're looking at. So we're looking at this case study because it has particular relevance for this particular element. Or if we're looking for example, at flooding, we might be looking at, for example, at early warning systems. And we're looking at the particular case study of this particular flood because it has particular relevance for the way we think about early warning systems. So, what is being looked at? And I wouldn't, as I said before, don't go too large. Stay quite specific with what you're looking at. And a third major aspect, of course, is to outline the methodology. How is the case study being looked at? So if the first one is why, the second one is what, the methodology is how are you going to look at the case study? Are you going to use mainly documents, so it's going to be a kind of desktop study? Are you going to use key data sources like databases, so it's going to be mainly a quantitative study? Or are you going to be looking at archives? Are you going to be looking, for example, at reports and people's accounts? Is it going to be more qualitative, more storytelling, more about narratives, about an experiential kind of approach that's going to be taken? In other words, is it qualitative or quantitative, or is it a mixed approach that you're going to take? Because the way you look at a case study and how you look at a case study will ultimately affect the lessons and the way you stylize the lessons that you're going to draw from it. My fourth tip is, in fact, focus the case study. When, where, and which bits or items are worth examining, analysing, and then evaluating. So, really be quite rigorous when you're looking at a case study in which bits of the story of a case you're going to focus on. And it might be that you're looking, for example, you could say that a case study could actually be split up into various different phases. So, for example, it's often argued, for example, with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, it was often called the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that was the period from when they found the photographs of the nuclear missiles in Cuba to the general agreement between President and the Russian heads of state to really withdraw the missiles and remove the tension on the crisis. It did not solve the crisis. It was simply seen to be a break point where success was made. Equally, if one talks about mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery, then if you've got frequent disasters, so if you've got a hurricane season in 2017 and then another hurricane season in 2018, or you've got flooding in Accra in Ghana in 2017 and then again in 2018, are they separate events? Does Accra in Ghana really recover from the previous floods before the next rainy season starts? So how you are packaging the case study and when and where and which beat items you're looking for are very important. Why? Because you're only interested in a case study in the way you analyse and evaluate it. You're not simply describing what happens. You're only interested in the bits in terms of what it can be used for your analysis. And that's quite important. Why is that important? Because if you understand the why, the what, the how, and then where, when, where, and which bits of the case study that you're going to look at, then this is a way of helping and informing the fifth point, to draw out the key learnings and then upscale them back to the general level of disaster management, to turn them into lessons learned from the case, which can then be part of a bouncing forward of learning more generally. So the key aspect here is to ensure that it's also conceptually as well as practically relevant and informed. So in that sense, it's important that we think about all of these different elements as a way of moving forward with the relevance of case studies. And that brings me to a close then, in terms of outlining why we should use a case study approach and the relevance and tips that are there for you to use. With that said then, I hope that's been useful to you all, and I'll stop the recording now, and you will be able to look at this at a future time when it's appropriate to you. Clearly a case study approach is important, but in many ways it's doing more with less, and that's the key to the successful use of a case study approach. Thank you very much, and I hope this is useful.